All right, guys, sorry to shut down the conversation. I hate to do it, y'all, like that, but we're in our last session here. After a nice long day, we can take feedback if you want more networking panels for 1 and 2 years, because I'm not doing this again next year. So, all right, so we've covered a wide gamut of the energy sector, and I really couldn't be more pleased with how everything's gone today, and I appreciate all of your attendance online and in person. And here we have our last panel. This one's going to be doing a little bit more of an industry state of play. We'll have 3 speakers, the first of which will be joining us for the shortest period of time for just 20 minutes, and then splitting that last hour amongst the last 2 speakers. So I'm going to intro all 3 of them now, and then I'll give the mic over to David. So first we'll be hearing from David Boyer. He's the Director of Geology and Development Planning for the West Virginia-based explorer and producer Arsenal Resources. Arsenal is in the top 5 largest private producers in West Virginia, also with some NGL exposure. It's one of the themes we've been talking about today. Dave is also the founder and principal of the consulting firm Mudrock Energy. That's how I became familiar with his work first. He was one of the first people to identify the exploration activity in the oil window. We'll be hearing about that a little bit today. Dave will cover regulatory, labor, and cost issues facing the industry, as well as give an update on development trends in the Marcellus and Utica basins. Dave is a certified petroleum geologist and earned his bachelor's in geology from the University of Pittsburgh. Following David Boyer will be Emily McLean. That's who was featured in Natalie Peckney's presentation from the Department of Energy this morning. Emily is no longer a research fellow at the DOE. She's now the vice president of North America Gas and Liquefied Natural Gas Markets at the Rystad Energy, an international consulting and data service firm. Emily has prior experience at IHS Markit, Shell, and the midstream company Williams. She's a prolific writer and researcher, often featured on programs like CNBC, kind of a star. Emily and her team advise industry and other stakeholders on developments in the gas market. Emily has her master's in geology and geophysics from West Virginia University. And then following up our day, it's one of my favorite contrarians out there, Tom Laufrey. Tom Laufrey is the president and co-founder of Flow Partners, which provides its proprietary models and accompanying analysis to industry and investors alike, all of which are involved in the development of oil and gas or are exposed in some way. Tom has over 20 years of investing experience in the sector at hedge funds Argent, Raven Rock, and Silverback, after starting his career in energy investment banking at Solomon Brothers and Credit Suisse. Tom received his MBA from UNC and will be giving us some insights on the oil industry, LNG, and featuring his proprietary data set. So that's all for me. Assuming Dave is in the wings and ready to rock, we'll start with Arsenal Resources. Dave, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you, Daniel. Are you guys able to hear me fine?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, as you said, I'm kind of going to give an operator overview here of some of the constraints we're seeing, some of the issues we're seeing on the regulatory side and on the industry recruitment and retention side, especially with our vendors that we're seeing across the field. And then just going to go into some development trends, focus in Appalachia, and kind of talk about where I see exploration happening as we move forward. I'll get through this pretty quick, so hopefully we have some time for questions at the end. So in my role, a big part of that is, you mentioned development planning. So that's planning out the laterals and the wells and the permitting for our development plan moving forward. And one thing that I'm not sure how many of you are aware of, but the timeline on this is quite extensive, and it continues to get bigger and bigger over time. And so we lay out Gantt charts on our development as we're laying out, field every year, where we have to be, what we have to be doing. And if you look at it, before we get gas in the pipeline, this is an over 2-year process where we start with leasing and then have to get into our permitting, surveying, building the pad. It's a really long process, and it continues to get longer. For example, the Fish and Wildlife Service, they have a consultation letter that they have to put together for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers before we're allowed to do any earthwork. Last year in 2021, it was taking about 90 days to get these letters back. Our last one took over 7 months, and everything in 2022, ourselves, other operators, we're planning they're all over 6 months now. And so they're blaming, they're blaming not enough staffing, not enough people. But for whatever that is, I mean, it's an order of magnitude greater of what we're seeing in these permit applications. Another thing that's came out in the last couple of months is a cement switchover. So in the plants up here in Appalachia, we're transitioning all the cement factories from Class A to Class L. Now, a lot of the properties, everything is the same. The main reason they're doing this is the CO2 emissions on Class L is lower than Class A. However, on the permitting side, it still comes into cause issues. Again, we have to get these permits applied for so much before we're drilling. But now this transition to Class A to Class L, we have to modify all of our permits. In Ohio, it's a very easy process. It's 24 hours. You give a call to the inspector, you can change it over from Class A to Class L. However, in the state of West Virginia, where we're operating, it's a 30-day notice period. So we have to go out and notify all our landowners prior to being able to pump a Class L cement. And so we're scrounging right now using a lot of the last of the Class A in the basin for the wells we're drilling now as we're transitioning all our permits to give us the optionality to use Class A or Class L. So it's a lot of these little permitting things that come up, over time that just keep building and building and delaying, development throughout the basin. One thing I won't harp on here, I'm sure all of you are well aware of this, but that's the pipeline infrastructure. Appalachia today, if it were a country, would be the number 3 largest country producing natural gas, only to the rest of the US and Russia. However, our pipelines leaving the basin are over 90% full. So, that growth, as we'll see at the end, where I think growth is going to be able to come, is really limited to what we can, build up until we get more pipelines out of the basin. And in this current regulatory environment, I don't see that happening. I mean, MVP has been delayed for years trying to get the Mountain Valley Pipeline into place. Atlantic Coast was killed. It was 92% in the ground, well, at least completed. And then it got written off because of all the delays and legal roadblocks that we're seeing to get pipelines in the ground. There's news articles coming out today where New England is afraid they're not going to be able to afford the LNG coming up for this winter when they're only a couple hundred miles from the biggest resource in one of the biggest resources in the world. So, I mean, to me, it's crazy, but we're not going to see sustained growth until we get, more infrastructure built out of the basin. Now, something that's hitting our operations, it seems like on a daily basis right now, though, has been recruitment and retention of employees to our service providers. So if we look here, here's a couple charts. There's another one coming next. Right here in the purple, this is natural gas and oil is in black, showing the increase of production over time over the last 30 years. And then the chart over here is employment. Gray is basically your operators, and then the green are oil and field service companies. We're getting new people on site almost every single well. We're not having a consistent group of people coming and going, and it's really starting to kill our efficiencies. Another example on our construction side, we can't get enough truck drivers. We used to get 20 trucks a day hauling stone to our pads to be able to complete our well space. Right now, we're getting 5 trucks a day. So that's 1/4. And it's not that the quarry can't, give us more rock. They have no more truck drivers. There's another provider that his CEO says he goes out for lunch twice a week to different truck stops. And all he does when he goes there is he sits down and talks to every table of truck drivers to see if they're happy with their job or if they want to come work for him. I mean, it's hitting all of our efficiencies. We're seeing our services slip over and over again because we're not getting enough of these employees retained into the industry. So one other way I like to look at this over time was this employment production efficiency chart. And so if you look here, what I'm showing is thousands of barrels of oil equivalent per 1,000 employees in the industry. Back in the pre-shale area, so we're doing a lot of shallow vertical wells, it was very stable, running through here, about the same employment, roughly the same production, very, very even. As we get into the, late 2000s, early 2010s, I'm calling this early shale. This is where we've got a huge employment peak, but we're also seeing a lot more volumes of oil and gas coming online. But after the Great Recession and then OPEC price wars here, we had a big fall down of employment. And with that, there's a lot of focus back to the core areas of shale play development. And we were getting back to a higher level of efficiency that matched kind of our pre-shale era back here. Now, as we get into the last couple of years, when we got to 2020, we had, kind of this shale bust. We had, a lot of companies that were underwater, and COVID hit, and negative oil prices, and everything kind of went, really bad in 2020. But when you look at the efficiency side, we had a really big peak. Why is that? A big part of that was we have a lot of drilled and uncompleted wells that, as the oil price tanked, operators saved those for when the oil price came back up. So we had a lot of, work in progress wells that came into line with a lower amount of employment that really spiked this peak. And now, as we're seeing employment start to come back up, we're seeing this efficiency peak come back down. But our employment peak, it's still well below where we were back here. And it's going to be interesting to see where all this levels out. But, just getting some new employees out on site that stay out on site and continue to work is a big problem right now. One last thing that we like to look at quarterly here at Arsenal is our service cost inflation tracker. The Midwest rolled coil tubing, rolled coil steel has been declining since around 2021, but our oil field tubulars have continued to increase in price. So we've had 25 months of continued price increases on our tubulars. As we get into August of 2022, hopefully we're starting to see this roll over. This is the lowest increase we've had in those 25 months. So it'll be interesting to see if this kind of rolls over. Diesel, that affects every aspect of our operations, as we have all lots of trucking, different things on the rig. But I mean, this is really a factor of, oil price. And sand's interesting, where we actually had a peak back in 2018 and things have come down. We've rebounded up a little. The big issue with sand has been just the delivery of it. And just the logistics have become much harder over the last few years. And we've actually had to bring a lot of that in-house, having our employees being less efficient by having to source sand ourselves instead of having our frac providers being able to source it in. And so it's been a lot more work on the internal staff instead of using our providers from the outside. All right, so let's jump in. Again, I'm going through this quickly, hopefully with some questions here at the end, but let's look ahead. So Utica oil became a really big, interesting topic again earlier this year. Quickly, if we look here, as you move to the west from, this is the eastern, it's the Ohio border here. As we move west, we're getting higher BTUs, higher liquid concentrations. And the real factor here was EOG, who left the basin, has now returned to the basin, has had a really large leasing campaign out here on the western flank of the Utica oil window. And I say Utica oil window, it's a lot of condensate, it's a liquids-rich window, but it'll be interesting to see over the next year, 24 months, the results that EOG is getting out here as they've had a fairly aggressive drilling campaign. And they also came down here and bought all of our Texas position down in the southern part of this window as well. So they're really solidifying this western flank of the Utica shale play. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Just comparing to the Marcellus. So this is the liquids-rich windows of the Utica and the Marcellus. One takeaway between these, the Utica, we have a lot higher liquids concentration, liquids percentage on the western limb than we do on the Marcellus. The Marcellus has a lot more gas involved, but they have a lot more of it. And so when you look at volumes, we're getting a lot more volumes of gas and still significant volumes of liquid out of the Marcellus. You move to the west and we'll see that in the Utica. So, West Virginia, this is where Arsenal operates. This is a lot of my experience over the years has been. And if we look at, where are the operators um, right now, the leading West Virginia producers are all primarily in the wet gas Marcellus. So the wet gas Marcellus is kind of coming down through here, through West Virginia, northern panhandle. And it's really driven by Antero, Southwestern, EQT, who EQT has now purchased Tug Hill in the big acquisition here in Marshall County. And so, the dry gas window on the east side is largely undeveloped. The main operators here, whoops, sorry about that. The main operators here have been Northeast Natural, XTO, HG Energy has a big position down here to the south of us. And then here in the Orange Wells, this is kind of where Arsenal has been focused, producing about 200 million a day, mostly from this tri-county area of Harrison, Taylor, Barber County, West Virginia. But, there's a lot of exciting development that can still take place in the dry gas window of West Virginia. And then the Utica shale play, we're really early on the exploration across the state. The only significant development has been Tug Hill up here in Marshall County, West Virginia. There have been a few other dry gas test wells across the basin in West Virginia, but it's really largely been untested. As we zoom out and look all across Appalachia, we've also had test wells here in Greene County with EQT, some significant wells up here in Westmoreland County by CNX, and then all the way up into Pennsylvania, up in the northern tier, Shell's drilled a number, Seneca, and JKLM. So I think a big driver that could come into play here as we move forward in Appalachia is the dry gas Utica. I think it's a huge reservoir, ready to take off. And so, Appalachia, it's a steady basin right now. We're really capacity limited, but there's a lot of potential to grow volumes throughout the basin. And it's an exciting place to be working, and it's going to be continuing to grow as long as we're able to. Things have been getting harder on the regulatory side, but the resources there, and it's a strong competitive basin to be in. So, with that, I think we've got a few minutes here for questions. If we want to take any, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, Dave, thank you so much. And we'll be brief just so we can keep our agenda moving here. But two things that stuck out to me. I was unaware of this Class A to Class L switchover for concrete. Excuse my ignorance, but does that impact like your spud and your completions? And I would imagine that would have a similar impact on pretty much all operators in West Virginia.
Yeah, so the main thing is if you're planning out ahead enough, you're able to change it over now. And so the only wells that's really affecting us are the pad we're drilling today. We're currently actively drilling, and we're scrounging for operators, for service providers that still have Class A, so we can complete this well pad using Class A. So it's becoming very difficult to source, but we think we're going to be able to do it. We've already, assigned all the permit modifications in for the next pads. So it's one of those things that you just have to be aware of it and move forward. It kind of hit us as a surprise this summer. It was something we weren't expecting. And I think it hit a lot of operators that, again, in Ohio is a 24-hour notice to just get it changed. Or West Virginia, that 30 days really comes into play, if you're actively drilling a well.
Yeah, and it's another perfect example of one of our themes today of just the number of different impacts that the transition to a less carbon-intensive economy can have on assets that would be more obtuse. And then just quickly, lastly, I know this is a big theme. Tom's going to hit on it in his presentation. There's a lot of talk right now in the shale sector on whether or not we're pretty much just drilling tier 2 acreage. I hear two things when I talk to people. I hear, look, if we had better pipelines, we could grow. Look, we have the reservoir, we have the ability to grow. But then I'm also hearing from a number of different people who are, boots on the ground saying, we don't really have the best acreage anymore. So I know those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but and you can take off your Arsenal hat if you don't want to speak to your company specific acreage position. But do you think macros on a more regional basis in Appalachian Basin, do you think that we're trending more towards tier 2 acreage, or do you think there's a lot of really great drilling inventory? It's just waiting to be unleashed by somebody figuring out a way to get some takeaway capacity online?
So I think it's a mix. If you look up in Northeast PA, you look at Susquehanna County, you look at Cabot, Chesapeake, up in that area, they're drilling their inventory quite quickly. And if you want to call that the only tier 1 gas in, Marcellus, because I mean, they're getting, 3 and 4 BCF per thousand. Well, yes, we're running out of that. Can we still get 2 BCF per thousand across a lot of parts of the basin that are still, very economic? Yes. I mean, that I think is not questionable. I think the other big play is, again, as I brought it up quickly, is the Utica has barely been tested. I don't think we know where the core dry gas Utica is yet. And so there's a lot more exploration that needs to happen. Obviously, these wells are more expensive, they're deeper, but there's still a big play that can come out of this that I think, in the right environment, we will see this continue to grow. And I think Appalachia is going to be steady. I don't see us going a whole lot more than we're at 34 BCF a day today. If MVP comes, it gets us to 36 BCF a day. I don't see us jumping to 70 like Toby Rice wants us to get to, but I think we'll be in that high, 30s to 40s a day for a long time.
Fascinating and consistent with most of the models I've seen. Dave, thank you very, very much for your time. I'm sorry, you'll have to, if you're desperate to hear the applause, you're gonna have to wait till 3. We're gonna go right into Emily, but you'll have to take my word for it that we will be applauding you if you jump. So really appreciate you, and we'll be in touch.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, hi Daniel, how you doing?
Good. Did you? I'm not sure if you heard, but did you know that Natalie had a picture of you in her slide deck?
I did not know. That's so great. That's really cool. I don't know if she planned it or if it was serendipitous, but that's cool.
Oh, got a kick out of that. Fantastic. Well, welcome. We gave your prelude here to the crowd, and we're ready for you whenever, as long as you are. So you can launch right in.
Okay, great. Let me just share my screen here. And then let me know if you don't mind when you see that.
We're in.
Okay, awesome. So I went off of our discussion, Daniel, and the bullets that we both kind of agreed on. And I put together this slide deck today. I'm going to do my best to get through it in 30 minutes, but there's a lot in here, and knowing me, I will try to pack it all in. And we're going to cover everything from US to global, how the US fits into the global context. I have the title here, Unlocking Opportunities in Energy Crisis. And that's exactly what the US is doing now on the gas side. So a lot of talk around gas today and the focus there, but I also want to end on a couple slides around the IRA. I know that we had kind of a one-off discussion around that, and some of the views that we have here at Rice Energy on the implications of that act, particularly on gas, but also just on the role it'll have on the energy sector. So I'll just go ahead and dive in. I typically like to start just by talking about the market, a snapshot in time and where we're at, where we see it going based on forward curves, and just the things that we've experienced in the past few years. And so the biggest, factor thing that I think everyone can agree on is just the volatility in the market. Last year, we thought that it was just a short-term blip, and now we're seeing that this volatility might be here to stay. Especially with the elevated prices that we've seen. So most of this fluctuation that you see here in these spikes in both the TTF, which is the blue line, that's the Dutch TTF marker price, and then the JKM marker, the Asia spot price. Most of those fluctuations are the result of the energy crisis last year, and then this year the result of Russian flows dropping and what Europe has been experiencing all year. And so we do see, like I said, going forward, if you look at the forward curves here, we do see that markets are going to continue to remain tight. By that, I mean, we're no longer down at this $10, $20 level, where we're now up in the $30s and $40 level. Not necessarily here to stay, because you can see as we move out long-term in beyond 2024, 2025, we'll start seeing prices come down. But right now and next year especially, we will see a very tight market given the supply crunch that not only Europe is experiencing, but really just from a global perspective. The other point I'd draw your eye to is we have seen some momentum in the Henry Hub here, but Henry Hub in comparison to, that's the US Henry Hub spot price, compared to the Dutch TTF or the Asia JKM price, it's much, much lower, right? We don't really see as much momentum being carried over as a result of Russian flows falling off, the result of the war and the impacts that have been ongoing. Most of the volatility and changes that we've seen this year in prices is really due to regional fundamentals. And I'll get into that a little bit today too. So moving on, just to talk a little bit about Europe, I think it's important to talk here on what's happening in Europe because it really is changing the long-term views that we have for gas, or it already has. In short, we've revised up gas demand, especially LNG demand in the midterm and long term as a result of Europe requiring more gas to wean itself off of Russian supplies. So just some statistics here, Europe has actually seen gas supplies from Russia down over 70, well, now it's 80% year to date. So you can see this blue line here, that decline actually started really in 2020. And so Europe kind of had its eye on what was going on between Russian supplies. And then of course, this past year and this year especially, we've seen supplies coming down further. And now there's only 2 pipelines that are providing piped gas into Europe, and that's Naftogaz and Turkstream. So there is a trickle of flow, and that is supporting the European market. But really where Europe has been able to offset this loss is through LNG imports. And the reason I'm sharing all this is to illustrate or start, painting the picture that the US has been supporting Europe, and the majority of these imports are coming from the US. And so it really kind of, to tell the story about the US and what the US has done to help out Europe, you have to start here and focus on just where Europe's sitting. In terms of this winter and really throughout the year leading up to this coming winter, Europe was in a position where they were seeing extremely low inventories at the start of the year, started bringing in those LNG imports that boosted throughout the year and helped Europe to really reach their storage target actually ahead of schedule. They're now over 94% in terms of the top line 100% storage capacity. So they have very secure, healthy storage inventories. We see that they will be in a good position going into this winter. But the question is, what will next winter look like? And so you could maybe think, oh, LNG imports are going to slow down because Europe has now, a stable base for storage. But really, they're already thinking about next year. And the goal here would be, as these inventories are depleted throughout this winter, they want to completely, try to offset that and keep those levels high throughout the entire winter and going into the injection season next year. There's 4 scenarios here, but if you look at them from a color standpoint, the blue illustrates if Russia were to completely shut off supplies, so those last 2 trickles of gas I mentioned. And in those events, or in that scenario, we could expect to see really by mid-2023 storage inventories possibly falling outside of this 5-year range. So what that means for Europe is, demand reduction, which is very much more difficult to do than bringing in more supplies, but they're seeing the difficulty in shoring up supplies, both through piped gas and LNG. So that's the big question mark, how, Europe will be able to make it through this winter and really where those inventories will sit. As far as LNG coming into the region, really it's at max capacity. So on this next chart here, this is shown in million tons. This is typically how we talk towards LNG. And looking here at LNG imports into Europe, we can see that dramatic uptick in just the last few years, but really at the start of this year. And this dark column here, that's the US. So the US is playing a very huge role in supporting Europe. In fact, imports into Europe have more than doubled. And as you can see here, some getting close to that 40% mark in terms of the total share that it's making up on a monthly basis. So the question might be, now, okay, well, why is the US providing so much LNG and sending all this LNG when Qatar could do the same, or Australia could do the same? Why haven't we seen a ramp up in these other regions? And that goes to, or the reasoning for that is because of the way contracts are structured here in the US. We call them flexible FOB, so that's free on board. And this flexible LNG, these contracted volumes, they're very attractive because it means that cargoes can go to whichever market needs the gas. From a buyer standpoint, which typically LNG producers, so all of our LNG export facilities here, they're selling a portion of this upcoming production to traders, and traders are looking for that flexibility so that the trader can decide where they want to send that gas and to which market, because that market will pay the higher premium. So it's a plus, or it's become a plus in a way that the US has all of this flexible LNG contracted because it remains extremely attractive to the buyer. And we're now in a situation this year where we've seen Europe really relying on the spot market. So Europe didn't have contracts for LNG, these long-term contracts weren't really expecting to need this much LNG. And so when they had to turn around to find new gas, they went to the spot market. And as a result, that's why we've seen the majority of gas coming from the US. And what this has done from a global perspective is actually offset some of the demand that would have otherwise gone to Asia. So you may have been following the news and hearing that LNG volumes have been rerouted or redirected away from the Asian market, and that's exactly what has happened all year. So you can see this huge drop in January for the percent of spot shares that were going into Asia, and those have held very low as a result of Europe really taking as much LNG as they can off of the spot market. In the Asian market, I will caveat this with there was a bit less demand this year because of the COVID lockdowns that were extended. Asia actually had some relatively mild weather this year, so they were able to build up their storage. So they weren't necessarily in the spot market perhaps as much as they would have been the last 2 years. But definitely we're seeing a drop in that demand that Asia would have otherwise received because of Europe. And so taking that into consideration and thinking about how Europe and Asia, who are the two markets that will be requiring the most LNG long-term all the way through 2050, I'm now going to kind of just back up and talk about how the US fits into this. So I've already talked about to date what we're seeing in terms of LNG imports into Europe and where those are coming from. But to just step back here and think about how much gas we're producing, where that gas is going and what we see from a supply outlook. And then in the next slide, I'll show demand and what we see in demand, and then bring that all together into our balance over the short term, so the next 2 years. So this year, next year, and in 2024, we're expecting significant growth this is US dry gas production. And this is just showing that short-term outlook. The US is going to need more LNG so that it can supply global markets, really now more than ever because of that additional demand coming from Europe. So it's not just this short-term blip for that global energy need, it's actually more of a midterm to long-term. And so production growth here was already expected. We already had a bullish outlook for production growth, but that towards the end of this presentation, I'll show just the momentum that we've been seeing on the LNG side and in the LNG space, and really just the investment or the incentive now to go towards LNG. From a production growth standpoint, we still expect that the Permian and the Haynesville region will really drive this growth. So each of those regions increasing about 30%. Whereas in comparison to Appalachia is probably going to grow around 1 to 2%. And that goes back to the previously mentioned takeaway capacity constraints and just the inability to bring on new pipe in that region. That can change, but based on the projects that are proposed, it's looking like growth in Appalachia will remain relatively flat. The other benefit or pro that the Permian and really namely the Haynesville region have is their access to the Gulf Coast. So that convenience of being very close proximity to LNG markets gives both of these gas basins really, or regions, the ability to tap into that market a little bit more easily than Appalachia, for instance. So keeping that in mind, that we're expecting this 12% growth in the next 2 years for supply. This next slide is showing growth in domestic production or domestic demand. So the takeaway here is you can see most of that growth is coming from the green line here, which is power. On a year-over-year basis, we're seeing about 1.5 to 2% increases in power, so gas for power. That gas consumption being really driven by just growth in or additions rather than retirements of natural gas power plants, and then offsets from coal retirements. So where coal plants will retire, gas plants will be able to step in and offset that and take more share from the total energy stack here in the US. So we see that we will have growth in total US consumption this year and next year. But really, when we think about it from a balance standpoint, we'll still have plenty of gas here domestically, even if we do plan to export significant amounts of US LNG, even with the growth over time. So growing domestic demand, growing supply, on the demand side still, so growing gas exports. So that in a way you can look at that as demand because that's demand from global region or global demand. But that is gas that we are producing. We're forecasting that, LNG is expected to grow in the short term, close to that max level of 14 BCF per day, billion cubic feet per day. And that's all on the back of international demand. So even with the growth that we see here domestically in demand and the growth in LNG exports to support Europe, to support Asian markets, there is potential, and on the next slide, just for the sake of time, there is potential to see an overbalance or gas outpacing demand, even with that demand that we use in all energy sectors for gas and with LNG exports. So it's a positive that we're seeing this supply growth, this very strong supply growth across the board here in the US. This line here at the top, you can see there it kind of goes outside of this band. So this is a 5-year average. And this is where we're predicting that based on the current pace of supply and based on pace of demand, it's likely that we'll see this over supply situation. Now that's in 2024. Next year, we're still expecting a pretty tight market, trending pretty close with what we're seeing this year. But beyond 2025, and this is, I really want to emphasize this. So this oversupply potential, again, this isn't a definite, but this could potentially happen. This oversupply would eventually change in 2025 and beyond. That's because new LNG infrastructure will be built, and we kind of term it as this new wave of LNG that will be added to the market in 2026, especially. So that will help to loosen the markets, bring prices down some in the near term. But in this next slide, you'll see that it will pick up quickly again once this oversupply evaporates. So the last chart showing through 2024, we've got this oversupply here. So these columns that are exceeding this orange line, which is LNG demand. That LNG demand is stacked on top of domestic demand. So this combined is the total top line for demand in the US. And then the blue here is produced gas. So you can think of it, as you move up the column, that's produced gas. And then the additional on top of that, above that purple line, is LNG. So you can see we have this oversupply balance, but beyond that, in 2025, that starts evaporating and going away. So that means you're going to see a tighter market and you're going to see prices increase. But we also are seeing or forecasting that LNG globally will come into the market and help provide some relief. So in terms of demand and our outlook, we've really revised up gas demand as a result of Europe really requiring more gas. And we've also had to take a look at how, the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, has impacted our views here in the U.S. So I do want to touch on that at the end and just speak to how that could potentially change this. But we always see in our forecast that gas will continue to remain part of this long-term journey, especially as we move towards energy transition. And that's especially, one of the biggest catalysts for that is this growth in European LNG demand. I kind of already touched on this, but we're growing from last year, 95 billion cubic meters here, over 160 billion cubic meters. So huge growth just in 1 year. And we're expecting that to continue growing for the long run for Europe. And this is really where we're seeing that that security, or that known that there will be gas requirements and gas demand going forward. We knew that Asia would require gas, but now with this additional puzzle piece, if you will, it's really shored up US natural gas. And this is just another example of how Europe will be relying on gas and where it will be coming from. So the colorful parts of the bar show LNG imports into Europe by source. So the colorful ones are contract, whereas the gray line here shows uncontracted, meaning spot price, spot market volumes. And so as a result of that, and we expect that this spot market, volume trend will continue, that's going to incur market tightness, more volatility, like we saw on the first slide on prices. And it's really because, remember, Europe wasn't expecting this huge loss in pipeline imports this year, and LNG has really been the only thing that's able to offset that. Now, thinking from a global perspective and taking into context just the supply and demand balance. So I showed the US supply and demand balance. This is from a global perspective. And I just want to focus your attention on the gap here. So this 100 million tons by 2030, that gap can be filled. But the point here is that we currently don't have any projects under construction that will provide to fill that gap. There are many projects that are planned that will need to take FID in order for that gap to be filled. There's also this potential 45 million tons of additional at-risk supplies or volumes from producing and under construction Russian projects. And that's because of really the unknown or the uncertainty around how those projects are going to continue to play out in the long term, whether Russia will be able to continue its relationships and really meet the contract terms with their buyers. So that's a huge gap, right? 100 to 150 million tons that needs to be provided, or that needs to be filled. So the pie chart here on the left shows where most of that liquefaction capacity could come from. And you can see that the US is the region that stands out, over 56% coming just from the US alone, whereas Canada and Mexico will make up another 17%. So huge potential from an opportunity standpoint for North America. When we look at this so this is kind of a different time between 2018 and 2030. But when we add in these under development projects and planned projects, you can see that they exceed this, what we're dubbing post-invasion gas demand. So there are plenty of planned projects out there. The question is which ones will compete and be able to move forward and actually be developed. And the other takeaway here is that over 60% of these projects are in the US, just like I mentioned in the previous slide. So of these projects, this is including all of the projects that could go ahead. That's why it's higher than the last slide. The last slide are the projects that we're pretty confident will happen. This includes projects that could easily be pushed out by Qatar and other regions that may have more potential to move forward. But it's important to note that there are plenty of projects out there. It's just a question of which projects will compete to move ahead. When we think about this from the current key players, so Qatar, the US surpassing Qatar this year in terms of LNG exports, and moving forward, we're still expecting that the US will really be the primary player in playing that role for global LNG. Just to give you some numbers, so this year, the US is going to grow from 95, 96 million tons to potentially 220 million tons by 2030. And I'll show those projects on the next slide. Whereas Qatar is going to grow about 50 million tons, and Australia will only grow about 5 million tons. So even though those are the three big key players, you can see that the US trend in growth is much more substantial than those other regions. But there are a lot of projects that have to move forward in order for this to really, for this outlook to really play out. And when I say move forward, we need to have momentum really yesterday and today to continue. Since the start of the war, we've seen a lot of traction. So projects that we dub speculative, that we normally wouldn't pull into this planned space for projects that we do think will go forward, have now come into the space. So one example here is Lake Charles. That project we had considered speculative, but it's actually seen a lot of traction and activity for contracting since the start of the war. So as a result, Europe has really been changing the landscape for LNG and long-term effects on global gas and LNG. And that goes all the way back to the US and how the US is impacted. So projects like Lake Charles coming forward, several projects that we were expecting only one phase to move forward now looks like the second phase is going to happen. For instance, Plaquemines here, so that's the orange column. So these projects, if they all move forward ahead or on time or ahead of schedule, are likely to see this boost or this strong ramp up in LNG production in the US. And that is when we'll start seeing some balance or rebalancing of the markets globally with the strength in LNG supply. But it's really the US that is seeing the majority of opportunity. Just to give you an example of how some of these contracting activities have been playing out, you might be wondering why US Gulf Coast projects or US projects have been dominating the activity. That's all these projects here circled in the green box, and you can see just the majority of them are from the US. The section to the right of the chart here you can see is off-takers, and so anywhere that's filled in, that's the contracted volumes that have been contracted. So in terms of activity, the US is really standing out here. The reason that we're seeing this activity as opposed to other expansion projects around the globe is really that, gas producers want long-term contracts so that they can support these capital intensive projects, to expand their LNG and capacity. And the US is a great example for that. LNG projects here in the US and their producers need these long-term contracts. And currently, sellers don't want that spot exposure, but it's just too much risk, from a buyer standpoint to take that spot exposure, but a seller is okay with that. So it's because of those flexible LNG contract terms why we're seeing a lot of this momentum and traction here in the US. From a global standpoint, we still see that these projects for the US in particular are the strongest, have the strongest potential to move ahead. So even though there are cheaper, more economic projects in Qatar, for instance, we just haven't seen the momentum to say that those will take crown for, the competition between what's here in the US. So that's a huge plus for us from an economic standpoint and from an energy security standpoint globally. And really the US has the gas here that it is available. We just need the infrastructure to really see it make its way overseas and also to support us here at home domestically. So my last section, I have 2 slides. I just want to talk to the IRA. And I'm kind of being weary of time, so I'll just give it a minute. So just pivoting away from the global perspective and the US perspective and coming back to just what are some of the potential policies and regulatory implications that could affect US in general. And I've pulled this from one of our dashboards that we provide. And this is from power mix, or this is showing the power mix, so power generation, and really just a comparison between traditional energies and renewables. So to kind of summarize here, and you should be able to see it with this huge wedge between now and 2050, that growth in solar and wind is really going to be the exponential growth that we're expecting. But the red column here, that's gas, and we still expect that is needed. In terms of the IRA, though, what the IRA has done is really incentivizing carbon capture, CCUS technologies, and that's across the board. So that will apply to gas, that will apply to nuclear and coal, but most likely going to really impact gas and nuclear on new and existing plants, probably not so much on the coal side. But what it does say is that if all of these are being impacted, nuclear and gas, then what is there any potential that could be a net negative for gas? And we've had a lot of internal debates on this, on just, what is that impact and how will that play out? And really the answer is it's probably too early to make those estimates. But we do know that the more economic that you're going to make nuclear and possibly coal plants, the longer that they'll stick around. And that could really take market share away from natural gas plants, but also impact the US from an emission standpoint. So if you leave those, dirtier facilities in the market, then obviously we can't meet our emissions goals sooner or even potentially on time, but I doubt it would get to that. I really think it would be a more of a marginal impact from the IRA on seeing an offset of those dirtier fossil fuels and even gas in general. So we do think that there will be a fiercer competition on a geography from a geographic standpoint. So in the Northeast, for instance, where there's already been an announcement for a gas plant that will add CCUS technologies, and they specifically mentioned the IRA in that announcement. So we think more of that will go forward, which means more natural gas facilities will be adding carbon capture, which is a huge plus from an environmental standpoint. And then just the last slide, and I'm almost done. So just thinking about that from an emissions standpoint and what that means, we've always, had this forecast for, displacing coal with gas. We still expect here at ISTAT, our view is that gas will be part of the long run. That hasn't changed with the Inflation Reduction Act. There was news of some coal power stations potentially putting CCUS technologies on. One in particular in San Juan has actually retracted that statement. So it's probably not likely that coal will really see a lot of ability to incentivize the act. And so what that means is gas is more likely to be able to grow with the act. And of course, across all, I know I'm focusing here on traditional energies, fossil fuels, but across the board, you're going to see renewables really just take advantage of the incentives here. But it's just important to mention that we're expecting over 90% of power generation to be emission-free by 2050. And you can see here just that decline in direct emissions shown by energy source. It's huge. So, and we're already achieving that. We're in the right direction. And that, I guess, would be the takeaway that I'd like to just drive home is we are moving in the right direction. While, here in the US, we need more gas from a domestic standpoint. Globally, we know we need more gas in order to meet demand before we can start seeing renewables offset that and really bridge that towards energy transition. So gas will play a very critical role in that. And as we move ahead, we need the incentives, and we need additional investments to really make that happen. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Daniel. Take a drink of water.
I'm sorry, I have a couple questions, but I don't want to eat it into too much of Tom's time. Just want to highlight to those of us listening in, I'm really happy that Emily did do those last two slides. It's something we discussed, and I think it's important to underline the possibility that the IRA is going to extend the lifeline of a number of different type of generation sources, natural gas included. So, the Democratic Party has had a history of being very, creating a lot of a policy framework that's favorable to natural gas, despite some of their other talking points. And I don't think the IRA is an exception. Emily, thank you very, very much for this. It was great. I was surprised to see. One really, really quick question. I saw the gas demand decreasing after 2025. in one of your slides. It might be too hard to remember which slide it is, but I was surprised about that. So I might follow up with you on that one because I did get a question on that.
Sure.
That doesn't come to mind?
From a global perspective, we see gas demand as a result of the offset of renewables will decline in the 2030s, early 2030s. In the US, we'll start to see gas demand decline a little bit, really kind of close to that. So 2027, 2028. So yes, gas demand is in decline, and it's absolutely like, the result of renewables and really offsetting that energy mix. And it's a positive, right? I mean, I've left it here on the emission slide, and that's a positive in the standpoint that we will move closer to those energy transition goals. There's really no other way to compare it with even Europe, for instance, who's really doubled down on renewables. I think you could agree that the US is also a huge proponent and wanting to see these energy sources coming into the mix more. And that will happen. So we have that forecasted, baked into our forecasts. And that's why I saw that decline.
Cool. Great. Again, I really appreciate it. Thank you, Emily. We're going to try to get Tom on, and we'll be in touch.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks again.
So I think what we can do is I'll promise to try to keep it interesting. Emily presented a lot of that background fact information. We can kind of go from the facts to our forecasts, and then hopefully have a few minutes to get into the gray area that we can all debate, which is kind of gonna be more interesting. So quickly at Flow, this is just a quick description of how we combine an investment process with forecasting. We do this with big data. We do it by strategically building information assets that we're going to use. It lets us create a haystack so we can find the needle. Our customers are hedge funds, minerals, midstream, upstream, and legal, which I can get into a little bit because our audience may be a little tilted that way. But some of the things that we've done in the past is take this information and use it to find anomalies. So Daniel and I have worked together on Diversified quite a bit. What we were doing simultaneous with Daniel's work was, because we mass forecast and they have 100,000 wells, we could understand that their decline rate was abnormally high. That led to a series of investigations on the asset from our own experience, and most of them proved to be true. And Daniel and I collaborated on some pretty fun stuff because we were able to go suss that out. One of the other pieces here that's, I think, pretty interesting to the legal and regulatory community is there's a name on this list where we did some ex post work on management statements about the quality of their assets. This is unusual to take this into the legal realm, or so we're told, but we were able to see so much data that we were able to reconstruct the timeline of what was happening at the company. And the investigators for the investors, the plaintiffs' attorneys, were able to go get all of the people involved and say, yeah, I wasn't filing the Railroad Commission reports on time because I was asked by my senior person not to, because we were obfuscating the data. And it kind of goes on and on. So there's some really interesting work there, and there's a magistrate opinion out that speaks highly of it. On the positive side of things, we've been able to forecast this Super Bowl cycle that's happening right now. And a lot of that is due to really good production forecasting. And one of the key things we're going to talk about today is drilling inventory. So the number of places that you have to drill is very sensitive to how fast you grow, especially at this stage in shale development. That is keeping us from killing the commodity price right now. It's also going to play into everything that Emily just said about LNG growth. So diving right into that topic, and she put up a lot of really great slides. Something that I want to show everybody is the Nord Stream was a really consistent source of supply. So what we're looking at here is supply over the course of the year. It's very linear. It's just delivered the same amount every day. And that's been broken off. The second thing is this has only been going on for 6 months. So we're very new to this situation. We haven't even gotten through a full year, a winter, and we've only been through half of a restocking season. Where I think we should be concerned about policy is when our political elites start thinking that it's mission accomplished. We saw that headline in Reuters, and all I could think about was George Bush on the battleship. But here's the same TTF chart that Emily put up. It spiked as we started restocking, but what was happening at the same time was the euro was getting killed. And what we haven't gotten to yet is the Asian import season. So far through this year, all of US LNG exports have been grabbed in this right chart by the US. So the US is boxing out Europe, and typically Asia comes back to the market this season. So when we've seen price abate here, storage is full. We can't put any more in storage right now, but the winter's about to start and we need flows. So this puts Europe in a tough situation. This is Homer's rock and a hard place. So as the euro weakens, natural gas prices get more expensive for them. It's going to be very hard to ration. At the upper bound to make it through the winter, people are talking about 20% rationing. That looks like a 15-degree Fahrenheit decrease in heat in your house. People are going to freeze if we're at 20% rationing. So it's politically unpalatable, and we have to start thinking about where sovereigns begin to intervene. And Germany's trade balance is obviously destroyed. We have hedge fund clients who are thinking about how industries are going to move out of Europe, and that's everything from cement to data centers. But then if we want to get into some of our real proprietary stuff, where Emily left off was on the growth of LNG. That has to happen in order to resupply Europe. And the magnitude of what we're talking about is resupplying an entire continent's energy supply. It's crazy. The amount of natural gas that Germany consumes during the winter is the entire daily production of the Haynesville shale. But the Haynesville is half drilled. So we are putting in fixed liquefaction assets. And as Emily just highlighted, we're growing the pace of that build out. But we have a relatively short duration on drilling inventory. So today we think about the big Haynesville well, and if these numbers mean something to you, great. If they don't, just sort of take away the big picture. The best stuff has very little great inventory. If we grow it much more aggressively, it's going to be gone before most of these assets get put in place. So the LNG assets are long-lived. Drilling inventory is short-lived. We have a duration mismatch. From a legal community, I think we should start to think about how those contracts play over time. I know our credit-focused investors are already thinking about that at the unsecured level. You have a bond, you have a company with contracts, and their ability to supply them is going to be called into question the more growth we push through the system. Kind of a quick view on if we grow at about 3 BCF a day, which is slightly more aggressive than the current build out, consistent with what Emily was saying, the Haynesville can supply Europe in about 5 years. But after 5 years, it will have declined back to where it's producing today. So this means two things. We need other assets. We need to go to other drilling locations in other basins, and price has to rise to incentivize that. And we can kind of take that to the conclusion and say the thing that we've heard Dave mention as well. When does the Marcellus come into play? We're going to need egress for all of our assets, and that's probably the biggest one. And then if we don't seek good access to the markets for all of our assets, we're going to see domestic prices rise. And there's a point that politically one party or the other is going to say, we're going to be well served by making a big stink about nat gas prices rising to $5 or $6 when a couple of years ago they were $2.50. And this story is somewhat similar, but a little different on the oil side. And what I want to get to are some of the policy decisions that we're seeing today. Hopefully I can do this in a minute or two and then turn it back to Daniel for some questions. We've been differentiated from the rest of the forecasting community in that because of this geospatial drilling inventory component, we have forecasted correctly that the Permian Basin wouldn't grow this year. What that has, and we always talk about the supply chain in every industry these days. What's behind that is how stressed drilling inventory really is at higher growth rates. It's a little bit of a nuanced point. There are plenty of places to drill, but if we push the growth rate, we can't do it. And so as a result, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is really holding up the world. The two charts we have here, this is our commercial inventories. They're being held flat. And it's similar if we look at all OECD inventories, but the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is providing that 1 million barrels a day that the Permian can't provide. And to that point about whether the Permian provides it or the SPR provides it, in July of this year, the White House explicitly said that they expected private producers to come in 1 million barrels a day higher in November. The short-term energy outlook at the time from the EIA had that prediction. They backed that off by 650,000 barrels a day. They're still too high, but bad forecasts at a minimum are leading to bad policy. We took that policy over to Saudi Arabia. We played tough and we ended up with a production cut instead of an increase. So the underlying situation here is the growth rate for US oil and gas is going to be determined by the amount of good rock we have and the marginal cost of producing it. The situation is tight. We're about halfway through the shale era. The next half can last a long time, but it's sensitive to how fast we grow and what demands we put on the system. And in the meantime, we have this post-Russia Europe LNG situation emerging. So there's going to be both the potential for policy missteps, higher prices, and there's going to be a lot to do in the market. So I did that quickly, but I would kind of rather have the discussion with Daniel. So if that's good, Daniel, you want to kind of have a back and forth on that?
Yeah, no, that was great, Tom, and appreciate your adaptability. Not to bemoan what might be the obvious to some, but in those last slides on the SPR releases, I think you have I see consensus catching up to you, but this is a place where you've kind of been alone in forecasting, and it looks as we grow nearer and nearer, more and more accurate. How do you see the SPR releases and change in that plan, especially given OPEC not playing ball, impacting prices and possibly having an impact on midterms?
So the first thing that I think could happen is we could see the SPR releases continue. And this is just this is an opinion and speculation, and I'll tell you why. The commercial inventories at about 400 million barrels, that's about, I think, the minimum the system can handle in terms of line fill and what oil needs to be in the pipes. So there is a limit that we can't really go below. Every time we get below 400 million barrels, whoever the president of the United States is starts to scream about oil. It's very reproducible. Now, if we don't have an SPR release and we don't have 1 million barrels a day on the market that comes from I don't know where, we're going to experience tightness very quickly. So first thing is, I think we could see additional SPR releases. If we don't, we may revert to them if the market tightens back up. And is this political? Yeah, I mean, I think that people don't like to say it, but like this is absolutely political. This is completely unprecedented. The red line at the bottom is not a chart of the SPR. That is a chart of total inventories, including the SPR. The SPR itself is going straight down. So it's about 50% full. There's pressure on the salt caverns that we don't know what the consequences are yet. That's not really my bailiwick, but that, in terms of timeline, that started in April. The other thing that happened in April was the methodology for measuring U.S. exports and U.S. implied gasoline demand were changed. When implied gasoline demand was changed, oil traded off because all of a sudden it looked like there was COVID pandemic level gasoline demand. And we know now in hindsight that both vehicle miles traveled actually increased, and the monthly data doesn't show that decrease. So yeah, I think what we're seeing in the data needs to be questioned. The purpose of the SPR release needs to be questioned. When this runs out and we don't have that million barrels to cross the gap, prices could spike higher and we could be in a worse situation than we started.
Yeah, it does seem like not necessarily the most prudential path forward, thinking about long-term and long-term implications. And yes, you planted that seed in my head. One of the times we spoke in the last couple of months about the notion that it's like right after midterms for a period, it looked like those releases were going to peter off. So, but now I know they've changed that rhetoric a little. If we could switch to Haynesville really quickly, just making sure nobody has any questions on the SPR. We were in the midst of doing our natural gas liquids investigation. I very badly wanted to write on Tellurian, and we had some subscriber interest, but we just missed that window when good old Suki did what he does best. I have a question for you though. I thought it was a really interesting aspect where you talked about, okay, look, it's the growth in production that can be bad. Sure, we can, I think it was like 2x or 4x Haynesville output, but then we're like way back to where we are now. You know, that's not necessarily a sustainable production output growth. Yes, this slide here.
Well, it's going to have to come from somewhere. And the choices are US and Qatar, and the pace at which we get there won't be instantaneous. But the Haynesville, there's a reason on Emily's slide why she had the Gulf Coast project circled in green. It's because they sit next to the Haynesville, there's good regulatory environment, and it's easy to get ships in and out. So, and the Haynesville produces great returns for the producers. So this is our number one target asset. And if it's going to be a combination of several assets that meet this is a theoretical approach. We're not just going to say we're going to give up the Haynesville to supply Germany. Associated gas from the Permian, I think will actually grow a lot slower than Rystad is forecasting. But it's going to be South Texas Eagle Ford. It will come from the Permian, and it will come from the Anadarko. But yeah, as we ramp the best stuff, we want to drill these wells. These make a lot of money for the producers, but they will go first. And then what's going to happen is we move into, I'm just going to go to the little bit of a busier slide where I have more information. As we move across from left to right, we're starting out this year, the Haynesville will grow 2 BCF a day. And then whether we grow 2 BCF a day or 3 BCF a day is only a matter of how much more infrastructure we can build. It's not going to happen all very smoothly. You know, these are big projects. It's going to be chunky. But if we get into a 3 BCF a day year-over-year growth case, and we want to have double-digit years worth of drilling inventory, and I'd kind of caution, in the industry, we don't think of that as very much. If we want double-digit years worth of drilling inventory, we need a $6 price to get those kind of economics out of the Haynesville that we see today. Now, part of the reason we've set that threshold at an IRR of 250% is there's a lot of overhead, getting transportation is expensive, and the price of natural gas is volatile. One of the reasons you can move down to a lower return threshold is if we see less volatile, higher prices. So things are spiky today, but if we see the market sort of accept the long-term price of natural gas is going to be $5 and we can bank on that, then we can move into deeper inventory that's not as good that we wouldn't chase after today, because you don't want to drill the well, put it online, and have gas prices go down to $2.50 again.
But to support the project that hasn't FID yet. I mean, I know economics, you know, I look at Southwestern, I look at a lot of these guys who have better economics in Haynesville than they do the Marcellus Utica. But then at the same time, I'm seeing negative, you know, again, we see negative gas prices in Waha. So I'm thinking, okay, we're prioritizing prime acreage. We don't have the new capacity to send it off. Now it's 2028. We need X BCF a day just to supplant, you know, our 2 new LNG export facilities, but we're doing it from tier 2 acreage in the Haynesville. For me, that's like a red flag carnival. I see a lot of issues that could pop there.
It's going to lead. Our work is leading to more inquiry from the infrastructure types than anyone else. So, and this sort of makes sense. You bring up the case about Waha. So one of the reasons that the Waha fixed price has done poorly is because ethane margins are doing poorly. So there's more ethane rejection is a thing in the Permian now, and the pipe is full. So we need more ways to process NGLs. That's more infrastructure. So it all, but we're also talking about Texas right now, and it's easy to do things in Texas, and we just need capital to flow in. Capital is a problem because of the ESG trend. But if we take that story to the Northeast, now we have an unfriendly business environment and we have capital constraints. So this is sort of the reality that we're going to be facing if we're pushing growth. It's easy to do in the Haynesville right now, and it's going to be done there. But in 2025, we're going to look around and say, it's getting a lot more expensive to do this. The marginal cost curve has risen. And if we haven't built the infrastructure by then, we're going to be asking the same questions.
Precisely. Yeah. Yeah. The only audience asked me to understandably not speak in such oil and gas code. What I was just talking about, Waha is a trading hub in Texas, and natural gas has been trading negative, implying that there's not enough demand. Tom, I did not know that it was in part because of ethane rejection, which is something that Sharon's actually done a lot of work on. So I'm saying here we're talking about the economics of Haynesville, which a lot of operators justify based on LNG export. A lot of LNG export plants haven't come online yet. Tom has demonstrated that we're going to prioritize tier 1 acreage now without that demand.
So is the idea that there's not enough LNG to allow for the export of the amount of natural gas, of the amount that we're producing, and that, because if there's enough, it's easier to see the price staying high over time. Whereas if you can't export it, that's what causes the price to collapse or be volatile.
Yes. And the fact that I mean, and Tom disagrees with me here, and then we can wrap, but the fact, how I interpret the lack of FID, final investment decisions of different LNG export facilities in the Gulf, some people used to think there was going to be a lot of those happening this year. That hasn't really happened yet. But how I interpret that is somebody who's got more access to data than I do is wondering, okay, once this plant's online in 5 years, will I have that demand that downstream in Europe or in China, wherever? And Emily and a lot of other people have, and I don't disagree with this, but model it's like, well, we need it. So that, again, there's a disparity there. What gives LNG people would say the lack of access to capital and a not liquid enough market, and that's a different panel for a different conference.
And it takes time to build any large fixed asset. And to my volatility point before, you want to make sure that this situation is really going to be kind of permanent. It's only been a few months since I think we can say, really even a few weeks, since we can say that Nord Stream is not coming back online now that it's been blown up. But a few weeks ago, we might have said, well, what if we get a new strongman in Russia? We like the guy, and he's really nice to Germany again. We shouldn't build another LNG export facility. Like, these are things that go into building a 30-year asset.
That's right. Tom, who do you think blew it up?
I don't know.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for bringing us home. It was a fantastic closer, in my opinion. You know how much I appreciate your hard work, and I highly recommend everybody to check out what Flow does. It's really, really unique, and I've yet to see them be wrong. So with that, I would thank everybody and their participation and their attendance. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did.